But in all seriousness, I have a couple thoughts that I wanted to share because I'm joining the school. I thought I might talk a little bit about a project that I showed a piece of when I was here before, but I thought I could dive into more extensively. And the reason I think this project might be worth talking about is because it's incredibly obvious. And in its obviousness, it lacks attention. And so thinking about corridors, we just went through that corridor over there. I became curious to understand this general architectural phenomenon, this thing that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, and to ask myself the big obvious question of how does this thing have a history that I'm not familiar with? How has the corridor evolved as something which connects and separates and divides? What is a corridor, et cetera, as a kind of staging ground for studio production, research, and a seminar. And so I want to quickly show some thoughts and some work from the studio, which I've taught in two different spots with slightly different results, called Meet Me in the Street, very long, skinny street buildings of streets, where the idea was to look at Los Angeles as a kind of architectural historical context of note, something that doesn't always happen when you teach in Los Angeles, to think about the corridor as a typology and to examine co-housing as a strategy of dealing with a kind of post-familial paradigm of housing a population that is currently not really always in touch with market realities. And so when you think about corridors, you might completely kind of glaze over in a sense because they are absolutely banal, and somehow that produces a kind of inattention to them. And what I would argue is that thinking about the corridor, there's maybe a number of different ways of looking at it, four of which we see here: sociological concerns, historical problems, things you simply observe empirically, and typological determinations. And somehow all of these were wrapped into the studio that I taught and the research that I did on the corridor in an attempt to tie a series of things together that seem to be only loosely connected. So thinking about, for example, the evolution of family structures, the definition of the nuclear family unit, it's got the questions around gender and housework, and the pile of dishes that we all inevitably have in our sink. Thinking about the sort of funny stop and chat clip from Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Larry David says, "I do not want to stop and chat. I want to keep walking," and how the corridor is this inevitable moment of possible awkwardness. And then thinking about how the corridor has its own history that has evolved from, thousands of years, and how that could be understood through questions of quantity and quality. So an attempt to organize a series of different kinds of questions together. And I think in a certain sense, it's a slightly impossible project in terms of its scope and in terms of its agenda being broad. But I think in that way, the studio that I've taught now twice and the correlating efforts have been productive fodder. So I hope to use this as a kind of test case to think about how I might influence the pedagogy or be a teacher here. And you can see how these four categories might actually manifest in terms of things that we can think about, how we live together, how we previously designed, how we use and misuse spaces, et cetera. And so in a certain way, these correlate to different kinds of modes that I've taken up: studio teaching, dissertation efforts, research efforts, et cetera. And so luckily for me, a lot of the work was already done in this book, The Elements of Architecture, which attempted to really take stock through a kind of empirical view of the world and to understand what corridor types exist. How can we look at them with the most kind of objectivity possible, and to understand their kind of inevitable, ubiquitous nature. And so if we look at this book, what we see is that corridors are everywhere. They're a very common metaphor. They're the pathways of trains, planes, and cars. And so they are both a kind of inevitable, fundamental element, but something that we as architects don't often really consider in a kind of intellectual mode. And so this book and other books that have talked about the corridor became really interesting because not only did they set the groundwork for what I was trying to do, but demonstrated the efficacy of this approach in terms of a wide a wide and broad overview of a sort of global effort to map and to chart and to organize the disparate ways that corridors have existed. So here we see a series of hospital plans and asylum plans, understanding the connection between mental health and physical health and the corridor as a kind of linear element. And then, of course, we have these slightly stylized photographs, which really point to the fact that the corridor only starts to be noticed, perhaps when it becomes a kind of problem, in a sense, when it breaks or when it becomes too banal or too long, too boring, too constrained, et cetera. So these photographs depict asylums and other buildings. And particularly with social housing, the corridor is charged with trying to effectively solve the problems of loneliness, solve the problems of, where do people actually socialize? And it becomes a kind of space where you pull your plants out, you leave your dirty shoes. And in a sense, it has a huge responsibility that we often don't talk about in a kind of, let's say, straightforward way. So this was an ambition to think about how that social housing tendency could be tackled anew. And along this pathway, I think thinking about Robin Evans and his work on the ordinary is incredibly useful because he is someone that I think has a very similar ethos in the sense that he looks at the ordinary and realizes that these are the things that contain the deepest mysteries, actually. It's because we accept them as neutral, we accept them as indispensable, and we don't often think about the power that the arrangement of domestic space actually exerts over our lives. And so this essay and others like it were particularly useful. And then I was also really interested in understanding how this construct of family life is another kind of architectural blind spot. And so if we think about this essay from the book Centuries of Childhood, where there's a history of the family as a construct, we basically see that the corridor is a crucial turning point in the way that the family starts to become much more contained and much less interested in a larger social kind of sociality. And so this quote says, the rooms were still independent because they opened onto a corridor. They communicated with each other. People were no longer obliged to pass from one to another. And it's been said that comfort dates from this period around the 17th century, born at the same time as domesticity, privacy, and isolation. And so I became really interested in mapping the history of the family and the changes that the nuclear family has gone through onto the history of the corridor to understand this kind of coeval, let's say, set of evolution. And so this particular essay by Mark Jarzenbeck, Corridor Spaces, really is crucial to setting the historical framework for these questions to understand how has it evolved. And he actually goes through a kind of protracted step-by-step process where he maps how the word originally meant someone who could run fast. Maybe when I was younger, I would say that was me, someone that could really move quickly, a kind of scout or a carrier of money, all the way to what he calls the Corridic Revolution, when the corridor actually becomes a connection to the street and becomes a kind of link to the outside world, to other moments when the corridor actually starts to take on more and more prominence. It becomes a space for being viewed and viewing. It becomes a space for accessing the garden and for conversation, and so forth. And so thinking about this sort of protracted history of the corridor became really interesting because we could see that there's actually a number of steps in the evolution, and it might not necessarily be static at all. And then what he kind of ends with is the idea that currently we're in an anti-corridor moment, particularly in modernism, where the corridor was seen as a kind of wasted space. It was long, it was narrow, it was secluded. It led to people withdrawing socially, and so forth. And so to understand how this came to be, exactly what what modernism did to arrive at this point and to understand the reactions was really critical. So we see these kind of devastating critiques of the corridor where, for example, Evans says the corridor was responsible for obliterating vast areas of social experience. And so not only have we tended to block it out, but it's had a sort of devastating effect on certain ways that we occupy, particularly domestic and institutional spaces. And so this was really interesting because you really start to get a sense that it's the bad guy. And so therefore it actually starts to become even more appealing to rethink it in that way. And so in a kind of sleight of hand, architects sort of used urban, let's say, phraseology, spaces that could be street squares and buildings, as opposed to corridors, foyers, and rooms, as a way of saying, well, let's make it like the city. That might be a way of kind of flattening the urban domain with the domestic realm. And so with these questions in hand, I started to think about how the corridor could become a kind of building itself, and to think about how the street and the corridor, often parallel, might be tackled together, and to think about a very, very long building, a very long skinny building that could become a kind of internalized street. And so alongside this question of the corridor, there was the question of the street and all the various literature that accompanies that in the past 50 years to understand how the street too has been sort of abandoned as a social space. So if you look at literature like this and discourse like this, you find a really interesting and complicated set of reactions to street life, street people, street activities, what the street means sociologically, anthropologically, et cetera. And so to pair the corridor with the street seemed like a necessary way of sort of doubling my intellectual curiosity. And of course, we could divide it up if we wanted to in a rather neat way between European and American views, where on the one hand, in Europe, there's a kind of positive connotation of bazaars and markets and the flaneur, whereas in the United States, we might see the street more often as a kind of negative thing, to be on the street, to be a street walker, to have street crime, street boys. And so this sort of dichotomy, which seemed unfair to me, also was interesting, especially because I was born in Europe and my parents seemed to really always be wondering why the street can't be more. So I was really often thinking about that when I was a kid, and to reflect back on which streets I was allowed to run on and which streets I was told are too dangerous or not accessible to me. And so then to map this set of questions onto modernism and to understand what are the different attitudes that have taken place relative to the street, the anti-street attitude we might find in the 1920s in Corb's City of Towers versus the socio-cultural vitality of the street in the Smithsons, in this street in the sky metaphor, and to understand what kinds of responses has the street elicited, how have architects attempted to reimagine it. And so when you start to look for examples of buildings that might be allies or friends along this effort, you actually find a great deal of examples. And what I thought was interesting was that in the 19th century, these very long, skinny buildings often came from a set of concerns about health, public health, and from data from epidemiological studies related to how disease spreads. So there's a direct correlation to a discourse around public health, social distancing, et cetera, and the kind of spacing of buildings and their length and access to sunlight and air. But beyond that, there's really a kind of endless amount of buildings that you could find once you start to look. It's almost like once you start to take this hunt on for very long, skinny buildings, there actually happens to be a kind of endless amount. And so with my students, I began to collect these, to organize them, to think about how they might be categorized, how they relate to circulation, how they relate to different kinds of urban proposals, not unlike Jennifer's book, Parallel Cities, in fact, and to think about how these examples might start to set up design questions for my efforts and for the studios that I taught. So here you see some of these questions that emerged at the level of the unit, at the level of the building, at the level of the very long, skinny building as a type, and at the level of the urban domain. So this grouping of buildings helped to then articulate a kind of endless set of questions. So the endless amount of these buildings then produced an endless set of questions, if you will. And what we sort of gathered then was a kind of working taxonomy, a way of making sense of these different examples that have been collected, some of which we see here. And they're sort of global in reach. They're historically disparate. They're not all 20th century, but there does seem to be an excess of buildings that are incredibly long in the 20th century, almost as a kind of contest, if you will, in terms of how long can a building be? What starts to happen when you take on this extreme length? And so taking these questions to the studio, we were also interested in thinking about Los Angeles as a particular urban site and to understand how a studio based in Los Angeles had the responsibility of thinking critically about the place, particularly with all of the confusion and ambiguity around urban context and what that actually means in a place like Los Angeles. And so tackling a kind of investigation of the city alongside readings from urban studies, policy, and land management was really crucial, because often these very long, skinny buildings are made possible or not made possible because of property laws, property boundaries, and concerns around property continuity. And so this was really crucial to also frame the studio efforts in a particular discourse, in a particular place, in a particular time. And also to really think about how Los Angeles is always viewed with this kind of baggage, this idea that it's understood through a kind of mediatized form, through a kind of mythologized form. And so teaching in Los Angeles at the time, the real issue was to literally go and drive around and to think about our experience of these freeways and boulevards, street walls, and to understand how Los Angeles has this side of it, but it also has the kind of empirical reality of being stuck in traffic and so forth. So to understand the consequences of a city that is both in love and also in sort of conflict with the car, and driving and traffic and commuting and signage and street walls, all of which are seen at different speeds from the car. And so this, I think, was a really crucial way of trying to understand that architecture, particularly in an urban setting, is viewed not from a moment of, a kind of moment of calm and stillness, but in fact is viewed from a moment of frustration while you're trying to navigate and talk to people and text at the same time while you're driving and so forth. So to really get the students and myself to just go and think about how we occupy urban space and to think about the correlating ideas of property and so forth. And this, I think, is in sort of contrast to Rainer Banham in terms of how he really appreciated LA and wanted to really believe in its vitality, as opposed to this more kind of critical approach. And so for him, he argues that the freeway is this kind of complete way of life. I think because he was visiting, he never really got too frustrated with the process of being there. And so taking all of this into account, thinking about the kind of ways in which New Yorkers and people from London come to LA and explain the city back to itself was really interesting, that outsiders are the more influential voices in terms of thinking about how the city has been put into motion or put into architectural discourse. So for example, if we look at Aaron Betsky's book here from 1988, he says the only constant in man-made Los Angeles is technology. Like all cities, Los Angeles is built up on vast and usually invisible systems of infrastructure, of irrigation, electricity, sewage, communication, transportation. The places where infrastructure erupts form the only causes for architectonic focal points in Los Angeles. Freeway exit ramps are increasingly ringed with castellated commercial developments, the arrival of water, freeways form street walls at a larger scale. So this idea that infrastructure, not architecture, is actually the bigger set of questions, and that these students and myself had to wrestle with the politics and the economics and the contingencies of infrastructure, not purely an architectural history, which might overly prioritize monuments and well-known figures and so forth. So the last component of this was to think about who we might need to build for, given the particularities of today. Sorry. And so the subject that I wanted my students to consider in the studio was a kind of freelance workforce, of which I know I'm participated in that for more than a decade, and to think about how a kind of post-familial housing could be a model, looking at the history of co-housing, looking at the history of speculative built and unbuilt projects that attempted to rethink how the nuclear family was not an absolute answer to the way that people live. So, for example, if we look at the Phalansterie by Charles Fourier, we see an example of a building where 1,600 people were meant to live together in a kind of collectivized way. Childcare and food production and cleaning, all of these things were collectivized and worked out in a way that the nuclear family was not a kind of self-sustaining autonomous unit. And so I became really interested in these as well, because you can see a very direct connection between that pile of dishes in the sink and larger societal values that we essentially enforce and encode in the way that we design and teach students architecture. So, for example, here's another instance of a set of projects that dealt with the collective kitchen, and particularly a series of reformers in the 19th century that were trying to think about how the kitchen could be made public and no longer become purely a specific gender's responsibility. So to think about how all of this attention to collectivization would then be the backbone for asking questions about program, as opposed to saying program is something which is delivered to the architect as a set of fixed square footages. Instead, the idea was that program actually was another set of intellectual investigations into workers' housing, the history of workers' housing, the history of co-living, the history of post-familial spatial environments, and to ask students and myself to tackle these particular kinds of communal spaces to determine their ratio, determine how much was needed of each, and to use this research into co-housing to stage these questions, as opposed to making kind of assumptions about their absolute nature. And the most critical component of this was to not assume that the apartment unit, was a de facto answer to how people might occupy a building of this sort, a co-living, co-housing project, and instead to think about other ways that beds are maybe not fixed, bedrooms are not assumed as a kind of answer to how we occupy space, but to instead think about how 100 or 200 people might occupy a building like this on a short-term, mid-term, or long-term basis. Are there nooks, pods, different ways that the bedroom can be defined or reprogrammed or understood? And so really trying to, in a sense, like open up a whole set of curiosities that challenged even things like, what is the meaning of the bedroom? What is the history of that word? It's actually not a very old word. If you go back 250 years, the bed was mobile. It could be folded up. It could be moved around the house. There was not one room dedicated to the bedroom. And in fact, that was a completely novel idea, 200 years ago. So the site that we worked with was this very long linear site in Hollywood that was 1,350 feet long. It was a kind of mid-block site that did not have a true kind of front face or a front facade, but instead was this kind of knife of space that ran from La Brea Avenue all the way to this Poinsettia Park. And the students were then charged with dealing with a site that didn't have any kind of spectacular or let's say overriding value. It was a generic site in a sense. So thinking about co-living, thinking about the history of these kinds of projects, thinking about how students were then asked to tackle what privacy could be, how collective space might be developed, how room divisions were up for grabs, and this question of generic space, particularly through walls and furniture. So all of these things became the kind of ingredients of the soup that this particular research project and studio put together. And in a certain way, it was a kind of overwhelming, perhaps in a both positive and negative sense, overwhelming set of concerns to thrust into one single studio. But I think at the same time, that's also what was the engine that made it go, in the sense that it felt like the questions were going down the right track, as opposed to being highly confined. And so this idea is really in contrast to the tendency to own a home. Here we see a quote from 1881, where this report says, "A small home in a yard turns the worker into someone who can truly be called the head of a family, a moral and prudent leader with a sense of his roots. His house owns him, teaches him morality, settles him down, and transforms him." So in contrast to this, the history of co-housing has the opposite approach, which is to say we should live and think much more collectively, which was interesting to consider, because I think this attitude is still essentially the predominant attitude that we as architects often deal with in client work or in other kinds of projects. And it's worth asking, why is this the case, and what does it mean for architectural education? And so, tackling all these things together, the other component was to really think about what we draw and why we draw what we draw. And so here we see a series of meditations or questions on plan drawings. The studio, in this case, was incredibly old-fashioned in that we started on the first day with reading and making a plan. And that was a very banal approach by design, in the sense that we decided to just tackle the problem head on, but to also think in a very kind of slow way about what can a plan drawing do, what limits does it have, and how can a plan drawing also be really concerned with life as lived, and to really demonstrate how the architect can understand what takes place within a building. So you see a series of questions on the left, and then a series of requirements for the plan drawing on the right, to think about form, but also speed, width, size, height, activity, and how the corridor would be articulated in terms of impediments or things that facilitate flow, walls, doors, and other kinds of elements, and so forth. So this gives you a sense of some of the kind of backbone of the studio. And then to one last quote, which is about the idea that the family should not be a kind of automatic primary bond, which, we could maybe debate how that sits. But Michael Hart said, "The saying 'blood is thicker than water' is quite telling in this regard, suggesting that one's primary bonds and relationships are delimited by the family. Hence, the family is an antisocial mechanism in that it isolates us from others. For example, when a friend was recently hospitalized in the ICU, the nurse said, 'Oh, are you family?' And we responded, 'No, we're much closer than that.'" Just this idea that, in fact, the way that we operate in a typical sense assumes that the family is a kind of antisocial mechanism. And so to think about the freelance workforce, to think about people who need temporary housing, operating in a very different mode. So to give, these are some of the questions that we pose, the kind of subjectivity, the attitude towards program, the attitude towards drawing, the attitude towards site, all of these things kind of stacked up, you could say, fairly, not necessarily neatly, but stacked up to reinforce a set of curiosities. And so tackling all of these things, some of the student projects, I think, demonstrate how these questions are not necessarily answered, but explored. So here, for example, we see a project that looked explicitly at the door, not as something which is fixed and knowable and selected from a catalog, but instead might be viewed through a set of variables. The door as a kind of movable wall, the door is something that has a variable dimension, the door is something that is multiplied, that doesn't necessarily always close off a room, but can perform a variety of other functions. And so to really tackle the door as, again, a kind of obvious architectural element that in some sense has been thought about in a fixed way. And so here we see some examples of how that has been done in the past, from Duchamp to Leff to First Office to Peso and others, that said, well, what if the door did something a little bit different? What if there's 100 doors? What if there's multiple doors that are open and closed in syncopation, et cetera? And so in thinking about the door, the student made a project that was incredibly dependent upon doors and how they were either syncopated or not, and what that meant for particular rooms that could be opened and closed together or not. And so here we see a kind of plan drawing that shows these doors, some of which are quite large and more like walls that move, and exactly how you define what is a wall and what is a door was up for debate in her project. And here we see the kind of overall axonometric drawing. And the other constraint that I should mention is that the students were limited to a 35 or 40 foot width as an absolute limit to the project. So it really became this kind of streetcar train-like form that they had to deal with. And this shows the plan. And I think it's also just, on a very kind of silly note, like these projects, we often at this time of year see projects on Instagram and other places. And these are projects that somehow are not friendly towards those formats. And instead you have to scroll through them. You have to look at them a little bit more carefully. They don't often make sense when you're zoomed out. They don't necessarily have a kind of spectacular appearance. We actually did not make any renderings or any kind of colored images of any sort. And so this tendency to use black and white section, plan, elevation, axonometric drawings was in some way a refusal of the spectacularization that we tend to either implicitly or explicitly see during the final review season. So these long scrolling plans had a utility. And then also not wanting to pin up, but instead wanting to have conversations that required us to sit and to have coffee and to look at things closely, more like a kind of seminar, as opposed to the typical jury format. So this antagonism towards the square format of Instagram and to the kind of distance that the jury typically sits were both really interesting to me. And also having the students write about their efforts as opposed to the typical extemporaneous dialogue that we expect from students and professors. Another project looked at the column as something which again could be reanimated, not purely as structure that is essentially just dealing with structure, but a kind of occupiable poche or something that is a kind of obdurate monolith that could become scaled up, could be occupied, could become more solid than void. And so here we see a number of examples of how the column as a particular kind of element has been rethought and turned into an architectural apparatus that deals with form and program and some of these other considerations that I put on the table. And so in this case, the building took a series of these columns and different densities and different configurations and used each of these in different segments of the floor plan of the building design to effectively think about how different kinds of spaces might be accommodated, what kind of activities made sense for individuals, for workspaces, for pods, for places where people want to be alone versus be together. And so we see this kind of GIF here above that demonstrates a study of that and the plan below. And then once again, a kind of scrolling plan that gives you a sense of how this particular project by Cody Carpenter used the column, often in very extra large proportions, columns that became 6 to 8 feet square, columns that became stretched and more plastic, columns that started to become more wall-like, et cetera, as a way of dealing with this co-housing program. And then here we see how the column also became a kind of facade system that was essentially a scrim or a series of fins. So the column really being charged with taking on multiple roles, not just structure, not just a programmatic determinant, not just a way of dealing with levels of privacy, but also a kind of system of mullions and other things on the facade that starts to modulate density and view and light into the building as well. And then a third project that I'll show is also actually dealing with the column, but the column here more as a kind of gradient, thinking about how poché can be designed almost kind of in a figural way. The column as a field, the column basically taking on other kinds of work. So here we see, Lucan and Serlio and others who have thought about the column in this particular way. And I should say there's probably overlap with the project by Cody that I just showed as well. And so thinking here about how the column would become literally more and more dense as you move through the plan. And in fact, Lane is coming to Minnesota for grad school.
Oh, I met her.
Yeah, so she will be here in the fall, and she was an amazing. Both Marianne and Lane were amazing students. And so here you see this kind of demonstration of how the column was a kind of modulating element, perhaps easier to see when you zoom in. And so in their case, they were entirely determined to make the 1,350 foot center space completely unimpeded and have everything sort of be folded off, determined by the amount of columns, the density of the columns, the spacing of the columns, et cetera. So the column tackling all of these kind of programmatic questions and spatial questions and organizational questions purely through its density, which we can see here in the ground floor plan, looking at a chunk of the building. And then it's a little hard to see, but this is the elevation and section above and the ground floor plan, which basically shows how the building is a kind of infrastructural, almost like a warehouse that's open to the site. And that openness is determined by the columns and their placement, their density, their changing solidity throughout this kind of second portion of the block. And then here we see the overall elevation oblique drawing, giving you a sense of how this column modulation worked with the different staircases and moments of access and moments of solidity versus void in the design of the project. And then finally, an axonometric drawing. So I think, this studio, at least for me and hopefully for the students, and hopefully this is clear in the demonstration, was really a set of open-ended questions that I still am tackling, as opposed to seeing this as a kind of neatly tied up semester.
I have a question. There's nobody in the chat. So, you start with the corridor, and then, you seem to continually be interested in program and activity and the plan as kind of part of this investigation. And the corridor is kind of the problematized thing you're focusing on.
Yeah.
And I think of when I was a student, there's this project that came out that was unbuilt. It was Daniel Libeskind City End Project, the housing. Yeah. And at no point does it really talk about it being housing. And it was really an urban line and an elevated piece. And I remember later finally seeing the plans and realizing that was basically just a double-loaded corridor. Mm-hmm. And so yours seems to be breaking down that, of trying to understand how, if this is inevitable, if this line is inevitable, how else could social activity, how could movement be defined? And then it's the walls, the columns, the doors. Yeah. It seems more like you're just regulating flows, or how do you think about this conceptually?
Well, one thing was that the double loaded corridor, I thought, should not be an inevitable answer to that space. I mean, some of these projects have the double loaded corridor, but they also have moments when you push back on it and you don't let that typological organization just drive everything, even though it is a dominant way of taking a bar and breaking it up. So I think that was one big question at the level of organization. But the other question is, how can you look at co-housing and understand how the double loaded corridor privileges the unit? And that assumption should not be taken for granted either. And so in the first instance, we really were anti-unit. And the second instance, we were, I would say, friendlier towards the unit, but also very antagonistic to the idea that housing is the literal addition of units together, and that the corridor facilitates that agglomeration. And so looking at co-housing and looking at social housing, I think that it's very difficult to move away from the efficiency model of typical housing typologies. And so that's why you have this other set of questions, like how can we think about the post-family? How can we think about work-live? All these other questions, I think, get in the way of efficiency. And so in this case, I don't think these, the students were saying, well, would these work? Would these projects actually be attractive to being real projects? And my answer to that was always, I don't know, but I think we can speculate that they exist outside of an efficiency model and outside of a developer logic model. And it would be really interesting to look at built examples that do exist and to ask what is their kind of economic model that goes beyond profit and buildability and efficiency. So I think in my thinking, it always came down to pointing to projects that have been built, particularly in Berlin and Zurich, and saying, look, there are things that are actually not so crazy if you break down what we normally do in the United States in particular. But I think in the Libeskind thing, I remember he had like a quote where he said, a line taken far enough becomes political.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. And I mean, I think he's much more interested in the metaphor. Yes. And purely in the urban strike. Right. But that was one of the projects that I collected, and like actually in the early stages of the research thought, oh, this is an interesting thought that a line that just goes has a certain efficacy to it. Yeah, and I think it was so model focused, in terms of how it was generated, and he refused to do a floor plan, and so the IBA hired another architect to do the floor plan, which you can imagine what that was. Yeah. But it's it's really fascinating. When you think of a line and you never think of occupying the line. Yeah. And I think somehow I tried to and the students did try to teeter along that line. So it wasn't always about thinking about occupation in a very literal way. But at the same time, not shying away from the plan. Like that's where you have to make decisions. That's why on the first day I said, we're just going to draw the plan. And the students looked at me like I was crazy. And, that was not possible. You had to go through 16 steps first in order to even think about drawing the plan, as opposed to saying, no, just let's start with the plan and work that out. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Yeah. My pleasure. Thank you guys for listening.